In 2023, Windstone Wallboards will open its new jib plasterboard manufacturing and distribution facility in Tauriko, Tauranga. Built on 12.8 hectares of land, it will be 2.5 times bigger than the current site. Designed with sustainability at the forefront, the new plant will have extensive recycling capability on site for water and waste. It will also include new state-of-the-art technology and equipment, enabling the business to manufacture the full range of our jib plasterboard products with a high degree of flexibility. The new Windstone Wallboards facility reinforces our commitment to manufacturing in New Zealand, and we look forward to sharing this journey with you.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Julia Gatley, and I'm the co-director of the School of Architecture and Planning's History and Theory Research Hub. On behalf of the Hub, Elizabeth Aitken-Rose and I have put together the program for Fast Forward Spring 2021, and many thanks to JIB for their support of the series. In these COVID-ridden times, with the travel restrictions that we're all too familiar with by now, Fast Forward Spring takes the theme Alumni Abroad and capitalises on the opportunities provided by Zoom to catch up with some of our many high-achieving alumni who have made or are making fantastic careers overseas. It's a huge privilege and indeed a pleasure to open the series with Professor Mark Wigley, who was a student in our school in the 1970s and 80s. Mark has had a stellar academic career in the United States and is currently Professor of Architecture and Dean Emeritus at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation at Columbia University, New York. He is an historian, theorist and critic who explores the intersection of architecture, art, philosophy, culture and technology. He has been prolific as an author, editor and exhibition curator, with books and exhibitions among the most celebrated the world has seen in the last 35 years. In this session, we're going to take a walk through Mark's career, pausing some of the highlights along the way. So a very warm welcome to Mark. Congratulations on your incredible career you've had and continue to have. And thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Welcome.
You're in Spain at the moment, so I'm interested to know what takes you there and if you're there for a short time or a long time.
I think any time in Spain is a short time, so I try to make it as long as possible, but I'm here a lot because my partner Beatrice, her family is from this region and this place, so we have a place here on the water and it's just obsessively wonderful. It's basically a beach, so it's my New Zealand thing in the Mediterranean.
Perfect.
Sounds it's borderline criminal, so I really shouldn't tell you more about it because it's ridiculously good.
All the better from Auckland, where we've just had a big storm last night. Anyway, I understand that you grew up in Palmerston North, and so I'm really interested to know what influenced your decision to study architecture and if you recall any particular formative experiences.
Actually, I was hoping you could tell me. I have no idea. Since the age of 9, I would answer the question, "What are you going to do?" I would say, "I'm going to be an architect." And it's probably, I'm very stubborn, so maybe that's just what happened. It was a sort of an error, and I just kept repeating it in my stubborn way. There's no explanation. I was not brilliant at building with blocks, and there was, as far as I know, no architecture in Palmerston North as defined like as a high art. Of course, there was architecture in every sense everywhere, but my only guess is that my parents were great travelers and always would show these wonderful slides of everywhere they had been. And I remember very vividly a lot of the mosques in Isfahan and so on. And I have a little bit of a feeling that maybe, but this is just a sort of romantic fantasy, right? That maybe I looked at the real thing and then thought I should somehow participate. But I think the answer, the truth is probably more kind of crazy, like it's just a mistake. But mistakes are good.
Absolutely. And you completed your BArch here at University of Auckland from 1975 to 79, when different staff in the school were running the 3 sub-schools of brick, timber and steel. And in our centenary book, we categorised the 1970s as the loose years. So I'm really interested to know what your take on the school was back then, if it was loose, and if that was good for you.
Yes, and yes, it definitely was loose, but loose with a kind of purpose, I would say, because I think what was brilliant in that moment was the uncertainty, because there were the 3 different sort of mini schools, and the new building was on its way towards the end of my time there. So you felt like you were at the end of an experimental period, which was about to be followed by kind of formality, as represented by this big kind of glossy building. So all this sort of anti-architecture, all these sheds, connected to the great tradition of the shed in the sort of mythology of the school, right, was about to give way to what, relative to that, is not a very interesting building, right, a new building. So it was like the last years. And in that moment, it seemed to me not even ideologically sort of strict. That is, for example, as students, we could move around between these schools. They were not like religions that you had to follow. And I think for whatever reason, I think I sort of started off over in steel or something and ended up towards the more experimental end, because I was attracted to the fact that the younger students and the older students were side by side. And more than that, the teachers were also acting more like children than adults. So I think it was a great time in which the school didn't know what it was. And that seems to me, it's always great when people don't know what they're doing. And so loose implies you do know what you're doing, you could do, and you're not doing it, you're sort of loose. I think it was more uncertain than that, and really fantastic. And also even the fact that the timber building burnt down somehow conveyed this sort of last dance feeling. And dancing, I think it really was. I remember Dave Mitchell really danced amazingly well. He was quite a large guy, but somehow when dancing, he seemed to be doing some sort of Olympic routine down on the floor. And this was very inspiring for students, right? That the teachers were, to use an old word, very cool. And as a result, I think there was a great camaraderie. And I saw you published that picture where all of us are gathered in the new building on the edge of the new building. It was very emotional for me to see it and to see myself there and to realize how many people were in that picture that, were such wonderful companions at that time.
Fantastic. And the actual experimental building that had multiple floors and multiple staircases and platforms, and was that the particular scene of the dancing?
Yeah, of course. And because it's just the only way you could move around in the building was to, I basically insisted on that. I suppose it was a bit like every child's fantasy, right? A kind of a playhouse where it's irregular and all the levels. So in a way, it really well captured the kind of, maybe you can use your word, loosening of the screws and so on. And I think was wonderful. Of course, I suppose, and you're the expert on this, but I think, somehow all the experiments of the 60s kind of were sort of nesting there at the end of the 70s. And so it was last dance, not just for the school, but also for the discipline and so on. And the other thing is that I thought at the time, and I think more now, that there were so many wonderful teachers. Really, that's what made the school. It doesn't really matter what the building is and all that. There were amazing teachers that they might have even liked each other quite a lot. Not totally, but quite a lot. And that's impressive for a school.
does sound like a great time to have been there.
Yeah. I mean, just to add one more thing. For example, there was also a generational thing. So Doc Toy was still a kind of cosmic guru, implying that somehow whatever you did could, even in New Zealand, and that's even in New Zealand was sort of the way of thinking of it, right? Even in New Zealand, one could connect to the great traditions, not just of architecture, but of culture. And I think John Dixon continued that. And then, you know, Mike Austin and Dave Mitchell, Nick Stanish, John Goldwater, all of these teachers were somehow your intermediaries between the local situation and this deep history. So my strongest memory of that time is how kind and open, to use your word again, loose the teachers were. It was actually a kind of wonderful time. And by the way, this is all sounding very romantic and therefore not to be trusted. As Mike Austin will tell you, I complained. All I ever did was complain when I was there.
Oh no, you were one of those students.
Oh yeah. And he said to me once, he said, yeah, you complain a lot, but there will be a time that you look back and say, these were your golden years, in the sense that you had time to complain and time to think and time to reflect. And this is one of the many things that Mike told me that is, I carried with me and actually tried to pass it on to my own students.
Well, I believe that Mike is with us in the audience this evening, so we might get a comment.
One of the victims of this conversation.
So this,
but you know, I owe everything to Mike because he had this generosity to what hasn't happened yet. So he would trust somebody to, if he just let them a little bit do what they want to do, go to a place that hadn't been defined yet. And that seems to me to be the essence of teaching. So I owe everything to Mike, not just in the sense of he really was my advisor. Some people do PhDs and advisors, not really advisors. No, he really was the advisor, like a guide, counselor in a way.
It's a good time to move to this document.
Oh, that thing. Okay, but just to say that teaching is the thing that matters the most. This. So it exists.
This is your BArch thesis titled A Case for Chance, supervised by Mike Austin. It is about the random interaction of independent phenomena. What really struck me in looking at this thesis was the extent to which it signals all of your subsequent interests in architecture, art, philosophy, culture, and technology. They're all in there. And there's even a poem called The Legend of the White Wall, suggesting a fascination with white walls long before your book, White Walls Design Addresses. So I'm wondering if you remember this document in particular, and if it was an important piece of work for you at the time. It's beautiful photos right through the back of it.
Well, firstly, Julia, I didn't know it still existed. I haven't seen it since the day I submitted it, and that's the only copy that you're holding.
I know, they should never let me take it out of the library, but they did.
Yeah, no, but I really had thought that it didn't exist anymore, and I've often wanted to see it. Like trying to look at yourself as a baby, you know, in this sort of fruitless effort to see if you could see yourself in formation. So my feeling is, of course, for me, I know that this is an important document because it's where at the end of it, Mike said to me, you know, you're good at that, you know, writing, thinking, such stuff. So really it was the beginning of this trajectory into scholarship. But it's also, you have to thank this, not just Mike, but the school, right? Because there was this amazing thing that at the end of your training as a professional architect, you had to write something for 3 months. And it is faithful to the old idea that the architect is an intellectual, that every professional is a sort of a thinker. So it's in that moment, I went down that path. Whether the content of it relates to my current work, it would be better for you to say than me. And it's funny that you've spotted the white wall obsession is already there. But for me, it was more like coming of age or self-discovery, whatever. And the photographs were exactly that, just photographs I was taking. And I've often wanted to see that document. So I'm really almost shocked that you're holding it in your hand.
Well, we can probably organise a scan for you.
But, you know, it gets back to this, you know, like the trouble is, as a theorist, right, you just pounce on everything. Everything is grist for the mill, right? So the whole thing was, of course, exactly about what I was saying before, that not knowing what you're doing and mistakes are very, very crucial. And that whole subthesis was about this, the history of that idea, right? That being a little bit out of control, not knowing, is the beginning of knowing. By the way, why would you want to know anything if you hadn't had the sense of not knowing first, right? So doubt is sort of like an engine of thinking, might be an engine of relationships, right? I don't want to sound too, you know, sort of fortune cookie, but it's really like that, right? That to the extent that you don't know, you learn or you grow and so on. So, now I turn it into a speech, right? Architecture is traditionally considered to be the opposite. It's the opposite of doubt. Actually, we build to cover up doubt. You could almost say that cities rise up and are their strongest and most permanent, where our doubts are the biggest. So how do you take a field like architecture, which is making sort of symbols of certainty, but for those symbols to be in any way interesting, there needs to be doubt. And teaching and school and studio and the inside of the architect's brain and the inside of a school are kind of laboratories of doubt. That's why that's why those years were very productive, it seems to me, in the school, because it was uncertain. There was doubt there. And good teachers nurture the doubt, right? But it's a trick, because architects are then called on to go in public and pretend that they know what they're doing and know what buildings represent. And so there's this very boring role, very conservative role that buildings play in society, but they're generated by very crazy people who think that buildings can talk. You know, only architects think that buildings talk. And so this is what's wonderful of the school. It's kind of like a room of children who think they can talk to buildings. And we fruitlessly try to tell the rest of society that that's really happening, and with not much success for thousands of years. Anyway, so that's the end of speech. So that was just trying to go directly to the question of doubt, chance. Yeah.
But they let me take your PhD out of the library too. Completed in 1986, entitled Jacques Derrida and Architecture, the Deconstructive Possibilities of Architectural Discourse, again supervised by Mike Austin.
Yes.
So the urban myth in Auckland is that early on in your enrolment, you went to New York and knocked on Peter Eisenman's door, and that he really encouraged your focus on deconstruction. And I'm just wondering if there's any truth in this, or if it's a sort of thing that, you know, a myth that's spiraled out of control.
No, it's not true. But
it's not true.
No, but like probably like most myths, there's truth in it, right? But it's not true. What more or less the way I would remember it, but why would you trust my memories, right? Why would, you know, I used to watch Coronation Street, and Ina Sharples once was having a beer or a stout or whatever she had with Minnie Caldwell, and she says, I don't like to go down memory lane because the last time I went down there, I got mugged. And I think that's, you know, so if we try to remember this moment, but what happened was in what was for me a very interesting journey, I ended up writing about deconstruction and everything, and always imagining that this was, you know, basically a philosophical position of the 1960s, late 1960s. So basically feeling there in New Zealand, more or less happy, whatever, trying to think through the implications of a philosophical movement of the late 60s, not thinking that had any relevance to anyone, anytime. And then an architect called Stanley Tigerman came to visit New Zealand on some kind of scam selling Formica. And there were allusions to deconstruction in his lectures. And that I just, for the first time, it occurred to me this was not just a personal fantasy, you know, many decades later, but there were people interested in this. So that started a kind of desire to go over to see who was interested in this stuff. So when I went to New York, I did meet Peter Eisenman, but it was the other way around. He was interested in what I was doing with deconstruction. And so there was great pleasure to discover that suddenly there was a community of people for whom this subject was not historical, but urgently relevant. And I found all those conversations extraordinarily exciting, so exciting that, and I think that Mike sensed this, I could easily just have stayed in New York, and he actually sent me a message saying something along the lines of, if you don't come back and finish your PhD, we're going to, and the word I remember is terminate you. This is a very un-Mike term. And I took that to being really a serious message, like, you need to finish this PhD. And this again was a great gift to me, because I came back and did finish it and then returned to New York to continue those conversations. So it's a myth, but Eisman, what became one of the assessors or the readers of the thesis, was an important reference point, because also, of course, in his orbit were other people interested in the subject, and so on and so on. But why do people want the myth to be that myth? Because the myth would be, once again, that somehow a New Zealander would need an American to guide them towards a French philosopher, right? So there's a sort of classic New Zealand. Yeah, there's a kind of classic New Zealand thing, and I love the classic New Zealand thing. I'm the perfect example of that. We are not worthy. We are so distant from the world. We're genuinely modest, right? Which is immediately followed by the opposite, which is an extraordinary arrogance, because since we are so distant from the world, we're pure, direct. If I'm reading Derrida, I'm getting it right for the first time, because I haven't been corrupted by all of this other stuff going on. So this simultaneous, genuine modesty combined with this extraordinary arrogance in equal mixture, that's the thing. And I think that myth is about the first part, which is the New Zealander feeling like there's got to be this other voice. And you see, that was interesting. You arrive in New York and they have the opposite point of view, which is like, hey, what have you got to say?
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And so when you decided to move to the States, was that a risk in terms of being able to work, or did you already have the job at Princeton lined up?
No.
We sort of imagining staying a while.
No, I never thought anything would happen. But that PhD was done as part of a kind of first wave of PhDs taught by Mike, who had himself a PhD. Maybe Mike was the first.
He wasn't the first, but he was one of the earlier ones.
Right. So we were, let's say, the first generation to be taught by others who had done a PhD. Right. So this was really the idea that this would be a career is ridiculous. It was the exact opposite. It was really, and I can't say it strongly enough, but it's really hard to do a PhD when you think that this is the basis of a career, because then everything you write is aimed towards a hypothetical audience that will love you and then give you a job. But the problem is PhDs are about changing the field. So you're actually writing for an audience that doesn't exist yet. So I think it was, again, I was very lucky to be writing in a time in which it was a very stupid thing to do a PhD. And therefore, you could really follow your instincts and try to do a good job and all that, but not. So when I went to New York, it's just because I wanted to keep going with those conversations. I was appalled when Princeton gave me a job, and I was so sure that they would recognize their mistake that during the first year there, I insulted everybody all the time because I thought, this is it, I've got 1 year. Or to say it another way around, I just was honest or direct, right? So I was, and of course, it turned out they loved that. So I stayed, and all my diplomatic colleagues were fired.
So did they give you a 1 year contract to start with?
Yeah.
And then it grew?
No, every year it was 1 year and 1 year, and then it got a little bit bigger. And then before you know it, I had gone from the outside of that institution to the very inside of it. And so much so that became, I was no longer the rebel. So I ran away to Columbia, where again, I was on the outside, but very quickly found myself on the inside there as well. But when I said before I was being honest, I probably just have a bad character. So I was very undiplomatic, let's say. And that, again, it's hard, it's really hard these days to be undiplomatic. Everybody's so risk averse. So so far in this conversation, Julia, there's a lot of luck here, right? There's a lot of lucky breaks.
Luck and good timing.
Yeah, but, you know.
So that's probably a good time to move on to with Philip Johnson. You're co-curating the 1988 exhibition Deconstruct West Architecture at the Museum of Modern Art in New York.
Right,
with the book of the same name published at the same time, which is one of our most worn books in the library. I'm not going to get all the books out, but just that one. How did the project and the collaboration come about, and what was it like working with Philip Johnson?
So this is a long story, but the short version is going to be exactly what I just said before. The reason I ended up curating that show is because I was invited to a dinner where there were a few young scholars and a number of architects, Eisenman, Geary, and a few others. And the dinner had been called by Philip Johnson. And during the dinner, they explained a kind of concept for an exhibition they were going to do. And I thought it was a shitty, stupid exhibition. And I said so, just because that was my mode at that time. This is quite soon after I had, this is like a few months really after I had left. I had just started the job, just signed on for the job at Princeton. And I said it was a very stupid exhibition, and then Johnson said something like, "Well, what would you do if it was you?" I said I would make an exhibition that proved that Frank Gehry is finished. And they all kind of looked back, and I wasn't trying to be. I mean, I really was sort of thinking. I said, because that's the purpose of an exhibition, is to celebrate the work of the last 10 years, let's say, to create space for new work. And Gehry, whose work I greatly admired, I thought had done some amazing work in the previous 10 years. So my argument was you get to MoMA and you celebrate work when it's kind of finished. Like it's a high cathedral of. And Gehry came up to me afterwards and said, "I really like what you said. You put a gun to my head, but you're wrong. And I'll show you." And well, I didn't know he was working on Bilbao at that moment. So he basically had thought he was going to, and he's a street fighter. So you see, as a result, I just found myself, so then they said, "Okay, you're going to do it." So I did it. And at the same time as I was starting to teach, so there was this, my first exhibition and first real teaching job, although I had been teaching at the school in Auckland, which was a great privilege as a PhD student to, again, we didn't say before, but there was such a kindness. As PhD students, we basically had lunch and coffee and so on with the faculty. This is a continuation of that thing of the experimental school, that the young and the old, that was where I was doing all the complaining, right? Sitting there permanently the whole day complaining. So basically, I just kind of went with that into that situation and started to curate. So this is really I think you had two parts to your question. I've forgotten the second part.
The other part was
what's it like to work with Johnson?
Yeah.
Oh, amazing. Because Johnson was old at that time, but still fast. I mean, he walked faster than anyone and talked faster. And basically, he wanted people at the museum hated him because he, of course, had invented that department. And he was thoroughly unimpressed with what they had been doing. And the whole point of this exhibition was to rattle the cage. And they hated the exhibition. They hated the thought that it was happening. Therefore, they hated me because I represented Johnson's sort of, it's like the revenge of he's supposed to not be there. So they tried to block everything. And the way it worked is Johnson allowed me to make every decision, every single thing. And he acted as the cover and defended me against all the institutional forces. And I have to say it was exhilarating because at the moment they know the politics of typefaces. And so I got into arguing. I remember that a couple of days before the exhibition opened, a man came to me and said he was in charge of etiquette at the museum and he was incredibly well dressed, right? Like something out of a movie. And And I was just marveling at the fact that there was such a person. And he said, which kind of color of flowers do you want during the opening? Red or blue? And it couldn't be red because that would be a clumsy reference to the Russians, and it couldn't be blue because that would be the counter. So I said, could we have both? And he said, it's never happened before. Let me go and check. And he disappeared. And came back the following day, say, your wish has been granted. It was like this. It was super exhilarating. And Johnson was somehow knew that what I was doing was rocking the boat, and so he supported it all the way. And I have to say, it was a very great privilege and very, very interesting. After the exhibition opened, very shortly afterwards, started to surface Johnson's intimate links with fascism and anti-Semitic writings and all of this. And I just broke, couldn't, so I don't regret working with him, but I'm totally supportive of the removal of the name and disconnection and things that are unforgivable. But it came just after. Now, if it had happened during, what kind of opportunist am I? Like that's when I would have learned. If I had learned this during, I wonder sometimes.
Right.
I don't trust myself to have just walked out. I probably would have acted out. I would have stayed there and made this part of the story. But you gotta understand how innocent, and again, innocence was incredibly useful in that moment. And
you kept working further with deconstruction, reworking your PhD for publication as Derrida's Haunt in 1993. And the introduction acknowledges that a lot had happened in the field of deconstruction between 1986 and 1993, including Derrida writing about architecture and collaborating with Tumi on the Parc de la Villette. Your own position had also changed from periphery to centre, and you'd obviously made friends with at least several of the key players. So what impact did those things have, do you think, on the development of the PhD to the book? Your move from periphery to centre in particular.
Yeah. It's funny, listening to you, you know me better than I know myself. I think a couple of things come to my mind here. I mean, the exhibition itself insists that work is not somehow derivative of deconstruction or a kind of demonstration of it. The argument is that there are certain things, if you were interested in deconstruction, this is the aspect of architecture that would attract you, right? So the idea was that a small set of architects were triggering certain doubts around the status of geometry and so on. And yes, there are occasional direct links, like Derrida working with Tumi and things like this, but they were not, let's say, at all what interests me. Although what Derrida writes about Tumi in that collaboration is extremely interesting in the history of Derrida's work. The PhD is the opposite, right? The PhD was interested in the architecture that's inside deconstruction already. Like what is the ideas about architecture on which deconstruction depends, even in the word deconstruction, right? So it's the kind of inverse. One is the architecture inside deconstruction, and then you are asking like what happened when deconstruction went inside architecture. And so probably I turned the PhD into a book to, as it were, reassert that previous sort of attitude that I have, but actually it's not a shift of position. They are kind of complementary. I insisted at the time that deconstruction would not be like productive of some kind of style. People were very skeptical of that because the museum is like a machine for style. I was, I guess, proven right relatively quickly, and the status of that exhibition changed relatively quickly. And now I'm almost embarrassed about how much honor is shown to to that exhibition. And in retrospect, I realized it was very, very focused, very polemical, and was surprisingly, I mean, all of those architects that were in there, of course, went on to become unbelievably important. And I don't in any way think the show contributed to that. I think it's the other way around. These were already very, very bright. Think of Zaha Hadid, really just one of the most amazing architects of our time. She didn't need an exhibition at MoMA to be who she is and would become, right? So, but nevertheless, that happened. But notice how all those directions were entirely different. Rem Koolhaas, most of those people had not built anything at that time. They went on to build almost everything, but there's no debt there to the exhibition. And at the time, they all were very aware of the fact that I was using their work to make a kind of theoretical point. They were all happy to be celebrated at MoMA. Why not, right? But there was not a kind of tie. So I'm saying all this because actually, when I turned the PhD into a book, I didn't have to fight for anything. In a way, it was almost, the show had become almost embarrassingly, respected. Turning the PhD into a book was a nightmare. It was like root canal work. If you leave a book alone, as you probably know, for 3 years or whatever it was, you're a different person. So the first thing you have to deal with is someone else wrote it. And then when you write a book to find out who you are, right? So imagine you're trying to find out who you are by rewriting a book by someone else, which is a previous you. So there you are, somehow caught between the old you and the new you. Nevertheless, I did it, and somehow it seems to mark that inquiry. And it has been really, again, the book seems to have lasted in the sense that it still seems to trigger a certain attitude and hopefully a kind of seriousness about, the right of architects to think philosophically. That this was at the heart of that mission. Like, could an architect? I was only a New Zealander, only an architect, only young, all these things. Do you have the right to write about, the most extraordinary French philosopher? Yes, and my point would be, yes, you have that right. And the kindness that Jacques Derrida himself showed to me into that work was incredibly embarrassing. I found actually when I was with him, he was always incredibly kind, but I couldn't speak. I could literally not speak because I was almost offended by how kind he was towards the work and curious about it and so on. Again, he's a teacher. Anyway, long answer to your question, but
well, what you've said,
it was hard. It was hard. Yeah.
It does help to explain a little bit why the next book, White Walls Design Addresses, was so different. With the focus on modernism and challenging the original claims of the protagonists from the 20s about their architecture being a lack of style, given that architecture is always aesthetically driven. But it kind of draws out a question about the relationship between theory and history, and I know that you've written about this separately. Like to invite you to say a little bit about the relationship between history and theory as you see it.
Yeah, it's a bit of a risk for you to ask me that. I teach one. Let me try it this way. I teach one class every year. I taught for 13 years at Princeton, and I've been a long time now at Columbia. But every year I teach a class called The History of Theory. And by the way, it's always the same class and has the same syllabus, hasn't changed, which is a crime, I'm sure, but it's kind of a conceptual experiment. Could you have the same syllabus for decades? Of course, I think every time it's different because you connect the ideas to the world differently, but it's really about how history and theory are inseparable, that every architect is a theorist, like I said before, but that also means a kind of historian telling a story. Right. So in that moment, it was very deliberate. Also, I was obsessed. If you look in the deconstructivist architecture show, in the PhD and in the book that came out of it, at the center is a kind of obsession with the relationship between structure and ornament, that which is supposedly necessary and that which is supposedly not necessary. And yet somehow it seems necessary to have the non-necessary thing around, right? So that's the obsession. Everything, it's the only thing I'm interested in probably ever, right? And so this book, which seems much more, as you point out, much more historical, it's about the same thing. It's about the relationship between the surface and the structure, right? Fabric, dress, the clothing, that which you don't need, but of course you need. So they're linked. I think it was also, and to this day, very influenced by Beatrice Colomina, my partner, who was just, as she always does, produces a kind of exhilarating sense of history, like history becomes, sort of an unfolding. Again, this is another part of the luck, right? The luck to be with Beatrice, the luck to be with Jill Matheson when I was in New Zealand, who was doing her pioneering work on gender in both practice and in theory. And again, look at Jill, right? It was practice and theory together. So I think this you learn a lot from if you're lucky to be with sort of super interesting people, you learn a lot. And I think you can see in that book on white walls that Beatrice's expertise in Le Corbusier has infected me, and so basically you're part of a conversation, which is a conversation at home, in the streets, in the school, and so on. In the end, I don't know if I like the book. Maybe I don't like any of them, but it's interesting that it's artists who are the strongest readers of the book. There's not a month goes by when I don't get calls from artists and so on. So that's again another thing very, very interesting. I said before, do architects have the right to speak, right? And then there's another question: who's listening? And listening seems to me such an underestimated part of life. And getting back to Mike's a great listener, right? So listening, this is something rare. And who's listening to us? And I think when artists are listening, then you're not so stupid. And so I think it's a stupid book. For me personally, I think it's clumsy. The issues are important, and probably that's why the book's a bit clumsy. It really mattered a lot to me. And you can see that all the other books are the same book, in different forms. Even the more recent work on radio and so on is the same. You're not going to get a new idea from me. You're going to get the same half idea that I had in Auckland, that same half idea. It's amazing. You can take half an idea, maybe it's like a graft or something. You can grow half an idea for the rest of your life. If you have a whole idea, probably it's all over.
We'll take you to your ideas about artists a little bit more now, just asking about your work from the late 90s and the early 2000s. Saw the focus on Constance New Babylon, with exhibitions and publications exploring an artist's visions for a city for a post-revolutionary society. And then in the last 10 years, you've done books and exhibitions on Gordon Matter Clark, known for cutting buildings open. So what is it about artists who work with architectural subject matter that interests you most?
I think the question would be, okay, what's an architect and what's an artist? By the way, Gordon Matter Clark's definition was that art doesn't have plumbing. The only difference is, of course, it's not necessarily completely true, but I think of architects as people for whom buildings are questions. Society thinks that buildings are answers, right? But for architects, a building is a question, in the same way that for a painter is somebody who doesn't know what painting is, right? So they paint their whole lives to try to understand why they love this thing, painting. So the greatest painters are the ones for whom painting is the biggest question. So for architects, we think buildings are questions. We just mystify it, and we find them enthralling. We talk forever about buildings. You do a conference on doorknobs, architects would go for a week. But people who make doorknobs won't go to a conference on doorknobs. They make the doorknob and go home and have a life. Architects don't have a life, never have a life. We cannot stop talking. So for us, buildings are questions. And then for artists, and architect's supposed to be a figure of certainty, but is actually somebody who's doubtful about what a building is. And artists who are professional doubters, who are asked to change our ideas about what things are, when they get interested in architecture, you get a kind of doubling of that, right? So somebody who's curious about everything becomes curious about architecture itself as a form of curiosity. Matt Clark was trained as an architect first, and then his work is so provocative that everybody calls him an artist. My view is he's just an architect who's not boring. He just lets the doubt that is at the center of our field become the work itself, whereas the rest of architects tend to then seal the doubt. That also plays into the whole gender argument, right? Because architects pretend to know what they're doing, so they assume this kind of masculine, man-explaining idea about architecture, and the architecture, which is radically uncertain, produced by complex collaborations of people and clients and situations and so on. And then somehow we act as if a single figure could, and preferably a male figure, could represent the certainty of this thing that's so doubtful. So when artists, and Constant on the other hand was a painter who pretended to be an architect as a criticism of painting. So yes, I'm super interested in figures who cross those lines and then really research those lines. Matt Clark's career was only 10 years. It's probably one of the most important architects/artists of the 20th century, but it's really 10 years of work. And the New Babylon project of Constant is also about 10 years. So it's amazing what you can do in 10 years. Imagine you work for 10 years on one architectural project, and the last 5 years of that work is criticizing your own project. So who could not be interested in Constant? I just got lucky. A friend running a museum in Rotterdam asked if I had an instinct that I would be interested in Constant, knew that I was lecturing about it, and asked me to do an exhibition. And exhibitions are the single most exciting thing in the history of the universe. Because they're so multidimensional, and you're communicating your obsessions, but also you have to tune into the obsessions of the visitor. It's just very, very exciting. So I love more than anything else to do exhibitions. I forget your question, but it's about, and so if you're going to make an exhibition, and there are millions of exhibitions all the time, wouldn't you want to make an exhibition about people who are changing the rules? So I'm interested always in those kinds of figures that do that.
And when you've done a book and an exhibition together, what do you like to do with the exhibition to make sure that it's kind of different from the book, but bigger in terms of the images being bigger?
Yeah, well, it's horrible to go to an
exhibition be different.
It's horrible to go to an exhibition which is a book on the wall. Actually, almost any text on the wall is horrible. Like, wall texts are the worst, most infantilizing thing. So normally it's better to treat them as separate projects. So for example, when Beatrice and I curated the Biennale, Design Biennale in Istanbul, we deliberately make a separate book, the Are We Human book, which has nothing to do with the exhibition, but has to do with the ideas that were in our heads while we were making the exhibition. There's another book, which is the catalog. So always you do it like that. With the most recent one, the Matt Clark show in Shanghai, there is an enormous book that, to my knowledge, nobody's seen because the show opened during the pandemic, which means it didn't really open. There was the exhibition itself was a timeline. So when you entered the exhibition, you were actually inside a 3D timeline. It was like being in a swimming pool with the dotted lines of the lanes were the years. So in that sense, there was a little bit more relationship between the chronology of the book and the chronology of the exhibition, but they are different things. So it's a long answer to your question, but I think the worst crime of an exhibition is to produce the sense that there's a book on the wall. Because why bother? Get the book. Books are better in the end, right? Books are forever. Exhibitions are short term. Buildings are short term. Books are forever.
I wanted to ask you just a little bit about your time as Dean. So Dean of Architecture, Planning and Preservation at Columbia from 2004 to 2014. Was that a full-time gig like it would be to be the Dean here, or did you manage to kind of continue to give, did you feel like you were doing much research during the time that you were Dean, or was Dean kind of all-consuming?
Yeah. Okay, I have to roll out the couch to answer this one. First, it's not a full-time job, because that implies that there's a certain amount of time in the week and then you fill it all up. No, it's 10 times a full-time job. So basically you do that during your sleep. You never stop thinking about it. Incredibly exciting, stressful, complex, and so many people are you're kind of like a gardener, you're kind of seeing what can grow. Your main responsibility, like that of every teacher, but is to the ideas that people haven't had yet. So how do you create an environment in which people could have ideas that they don't have yet? So it's to try to incubate that, to create a kind of incubator. It's incredibly exhilarating and super satisfying when you see it flourish, when you see the flowers grow and you see colleagues and students do amazing things. But you use every microsecond of your life to do that. So the answer to your question is I didn't do any research. I basically, for more than a decade, I didn't write. I did a couple of exhibitions just to, stay alive a little bit. But I never made the books that would normally go with those exhibitions. So the answer is a big no. I basically took time out from research. That's why I'm on the couch, because was that a good call or not?
I'm sure that you've enjoyed being back in the research space recently. You've certainly been prolific. And since then, exploring in particular human interactions with technology, from radio and television to social media and artificial intelligence and their relationship to design. Do you have thoughts on where technology might be taking architecture or the architect now?
Not really, but I immediately want to reverse your question and wonder, where could architecture take technology? Like, again, the assumption our field would normally have is that technology is sort of like it's biological, it's evolving in a certain direction, and a fast architect catches up to that, or a young architect, young and fast. And we tend to think that young is fast, right? Not always the case. We all know that there's some kids that are much slower and some grandparents that are faster, right? But there is a sort of ageism built into the way we think about technology. Technology, and this was the central focus of the exhibition that Beatrice and I did curated in Istanbul. Technology is what makes the humans human. Right? Technology is the most human thing about us. Right? It is us. So technology never simply takes us somewhere, since we are technology. Having said that, we are most of the time blind to our technological condition. We don't really think about the prosthetics. You and I looking at each other through our glasses, through the Zoom and so on. So we sort of act like that's a technology outside of our body that we are just using. But of course, we are different people as a result of these prosthetic extensions. And so if you take the argument that technology is what makes the human human, your same and important question is something like, well, what is the future human? Like, where are we going? And what relationship might architecture have to this? And there's a couple of angles on this. One is like, what is the architecture of that? Because if it's my glasses, right, and your glasses, it's also the room and the building. So of course, the buildings that we occupy are part of us, part of our species. And with radio, we became insects. This was an exhibition I did in Rotterdam, which tried to explain the idea of the human insect, that we became insects towards the end of the 19th century as we learned to communicate to each other with antenna. And we became a different species. We think differently, right? So, and this is both a new kind of human, let's say a new kind of client for the architect, right? But it's also a new kind of space. We live in a different, you and I are now in a sort of a Zoom room, right? So it's has absolutely dramatically changed the status of architecture, but architects hate radio. So you find very little discussion about radio, despite the fact that radio transformed our species utterly and transformed space and time utterly. And we claim to be interested in space and time and humans. And we don't like to talk about radio because radio seems to insult buildings. It just passes on through, right? So the whole history of architecture is a kind of defense against radio. So for me, there are two sides to your question. One is like, why don't we just look at ourselves, like look at what we have become and think about how we then might respond to that architecturally, like what might our design work be. Also, the implication is that the reason I say no to your question, I don't know where technology is taking us, because precisely technology is the generator of uncertainty about what constitutes the human. Hence the question, are we human, right? So whatever technology is, I love Marshall McLuhan, almost all of it, but especially his idea that each new technology changes the human brain and body. And this change is so shocking that it's invisible to us. We cannot face it until the technology is replaced by another one, and then we can see it. So we only ever see, as he put it, in the rearview mirror. So even looking in the rearview mirror, architects could respond to radio, television, and the internet. Probably, if you follow McLuhan, we are already some even stranger kind of species. And I'm convinced architects need to not only be in the forefront of that conversation, but are in a certain sense responsible for that conversation. And there are wonderful thinkers and writers and curators and in and around architecture that are kind of working on those questions. And in that sense, I feel myself part of a community. But as you can hear from my answer to your question, it's super obsession. I mean, to not think about radio, a relationship of radio and architecture, is to be a real idiot. Nobody thinks about radio and architecture, therefore architects are a certain kind of idiot. Yeah, there you go. And it's true. We blind ourselves, and our clients ask us not to consider the fact that we are a different biological species. And architecture is almost used as a prophylactic, as a kind of avatar of an old idea of materiality and so on. So we almost have a discipline of architecture devoted to veiling the fact that we have become, let me just give you one more example, bacteria. We are, you and I, bags of thousands upon thousands of bacteria. And we cannot be human without those bacteria. So to be human, to be alive, is to be bacteria and to be with bacteria in a very complex co-mingling. How could architects not talk about bacteria? Like, it's just, I don't want to say Neanderthal, because the Neanderthals were pretty smart. So this architecture is a pretty big stockpile of stupidity, right? Not because we're stupid as such, but in a way, stupidity, a kind of stupidity, is what's asked of architecture, and we deliver. At the same time, I'd rather talk to architects than anyone else about what something could be because of this doubt thing. So, sorry for the speech.
There's a question in the chat from a student. I'm assuming it's from a student. And that is, could you please share some practical advice for architecture students about pursuing their career in architecture?
Well, it's of course a big mistake, right? But you've already made it, right? I mean, when you tell your parents that you're going to become an architect, their faces fall, you could have done something serious. So given that you've made the mistake and that you've joined this group of people for whom architecture is a question, then you're part of a very exciting community of misfits all around the world. There are 1 million architecture students, more or less, in the world at any one time, all of whom are excited to think that architecture could be. And what do architects have in common is optimism, right? Despite the fact that actually the world is a super shitty place and there's no reason to be optimistic about anything, architects are always feeling like even a small change of the physical environment could lead to a better society, better culture, and so on. So it's just astonishing to be part of a community who all naively but romantically think that there's a possibility of a better society, and the way to do that is through some kind of relatively small adjustments to the physical fabric. So I don't have advice like, I think you've already joined this community. It does mean, though, it's good to listen and enjoy the fact that we don't know what architecture is. And if we don't know, as a young architect, you don't not know any more than anyone else. So you actually right up there, that's again, getting back to the spirit of the experimental school. If the best architects are the ones that feel like they know the least, then the so-called young architect, the older architects are jealous of the fact that the young architect really doesn't know, right? So in a way, take advantage of the fact that you're in that position of not knowing, and be reassured that you're surrounded by people that would like architecture to be boring, and your role is to resist that. And it's fun, and you're not going to get paid, and nobody's going to love you, and nobody's going to quite believe in the idea of architecture. So that's already lost. So just try to not be boring. I think, of all the crimes, boring is the most damning.
Excellent.
But no, I have no practical advice. Just don't be boring. Why bother, right? So if you're on the art, that's interesting. I don't think the architects are human, really. Actually, they look human. All architects from a distance look like human beings. It's only when you get close and you listen to them, you hear that they're crazy, and they really think the physical world is talking. So you've joined this group of kids that think the world is alive. And by the way, in thinking that the world is alive, you join most indigenous communities on the planet who think that the physical world is talking. So you're suddenly in a very, very exciting place. I would totally enjoy it.
Fantastic. And my final question is, what is next for Mark Wigley? What are you working on at the moment?
Well, to survive being mugged on memory lane, I only ever work on one project that it's not important. It's just like a fact, right? I can only work on one thing at a time. So when I'm researching and so on, so the last 3 or 4 months, I'm obsessing about a single building in Havana, a brutalist building of 67 to 71. And I'm desperately trying to stop being obsessed with it, but it's not working. So basically, if you say, what's my future? I don't know. I can't get out of this building. The text gets longer and longer. I get more and more fascinated. So I don't know what comes next, but it's just basically I jump from one project to the other. I'm in a very privileged situation. I also feel a little bit as a workaholic or whatever. With the pandemic and so on, none of us know what's next, right? So actually this doubt that I've described before, it's a kind of an arrogance if you think about it, when so many people on the planet don't know if they can survive to the next day because of poverty or injustice of various, institutionalized injustice and so on. So the idea that there's a community of people who can claim that not being paid, like I just did before, is a form of suffering and ought to doubt, there's a kind of responsibility to figure out ways in which that doubt might be of wider use to other species, and maybe we thought about other species first, we could think about ourselves better in the future. So I think but nevertheless, the pandemic means that even as scholars, right, I think we have to consider almost like the next project we do might be the last one. And so if I say I don't know which project comes next, I think it doesn't mean I'm lighthearted about it. I think each one might be the last one. And maybe the artists and writers and so on that we admire are people who felt like the next project was the one, finally, and probably the last one. So I think if we all imagine that we're playing the end game, and it's not a game, it's over, having said all that, then I may be nervous to start the next project, but I always think that way. Maybe this is the architect, what there is of an architect in me. If an architect thinks that, getting back to the doorknob, architects think that the doorknob is the beginning of the physical and emotional relationship to the building. Like, we think always that the smallest thing has a kind of viral impact on every scale. So people in outer space get improved by changing the doorknob. Maybe as scholars we feel the same, that even the smallest, most precise, detailed study of a person or a phase or history has the possibility to transform the whole thing. And I have that arrogance, and I think most writers do. You do. We all do in a way. And I think, again, the mission is how not to be boring. And if you're going to be boring, go to the beach. Like if the decision is to be boring, then get to the beach as quickly as possible.
At least enjoy it.
Yeah, the great thing of New Zealand is get to the beach. It's never more than half an hour, right? So I think this thing of the island. This is also why I'm obsessed with this building on the coast of Havana, because I think islands and the idea of the island is so important. And maybe this is once again the arrogance of the New Zealander. Hey, we got the island thing and you don't. But I think islands are required to think about the place in the world, right, differently than those who believe themselves to be at the center and believe themselves to be the world. So the thought of being outside the world, but therefore inside your own world, creates a dynamic that's super interesting. And it seemed to me not very different from the dynamic of making a house for someone, or, like it's in the world, but not in the world. And maybe I can give you really, I do believe that all the work that I've done is based on this idea of the New Zealand feeling disconnected, but then feeling like having what if architecture's relationship to all the other disciplines is the same as New Zealand's relationship to the world? Like, I'm not worthy, we're just late, we're not real serious scholars, we're not a real discipline. On the other hand, what's more fundamental than architecture, right? So I think our whole discipline has a kind of New Zealand sensibility. That's another lucky break, you see.
Thank you so much for your time today. It's been absolutely wonderful talking with you, and I really, really appreciate it. It's great to catch up.
Oh, you're very kind. Thanks.
Love to see you here in person at some stage in the
yeah, I'm going to try to come down in January, I think. But when I say down, that's the problem right there in that word down. But
it would be fantastic
down
to
is the
see you
new
in
up.
person if there was the opportunity for that.
Yeah, it'd be nice
to be
come.
really wonderful. But yeah, thank you again.
Thanks,
very
Julia.
Much appreciated.
Thanks.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
So just a reminder for our audience that Fast Forward Spring continues next week with Elizabeth Aitken-Rose in conversation with Elizabeth Farrelly, writer and opinion columnist for the Sydney Morning Herald, at the slightly earlier time of 6 p.m. So head to the website, fastforward.ac.nz, for details and to register for the webinar, or use the QR code. And thank you again to Professor Mark Wigley, and good night, everybody.